Welcome to this third workshop in this series of workshops we have for the Panamanian Debating Championship. Today we are happy to go with Naomi Panofka from Canada. Naomi is going into her second year studying political science at McGill University. As a speaker, she is World School Debating Championship finalist, second speaker and top breaking team of the Hard House Intervarsity Tournament, and is the 2019 North American Novice Champion. She also reached the finals of the Eastern Ivy, Evodio Cup, KCL Open, and most recently, the Princeton Round Robin, where she also was top speaker. As a judge, Naomi was DCA of the Canadian VP Championship, CA of Saskatoon WSDC 2020, and has been on the CA team of numerous high school competitions. We are very happy to come with you, Naomi.
Thank you very much, and thanks for inviting me to give the seminar. So today what I'm going to be discussing is matter generation. So not necessarily how to build arguments well, but rather when you're in prep, how to think of the best and the greatest quantity of arguments possible. Just to caveat a few things about the seminar. So firstly, it's probably going to be on the shorter side. I'm keeping it pretty concise with the main pointer, so you probably won't be here for too long. You can feel free to ask questions at any point in the seminar by either asking in the chat or just unmuting yourself and asking a question. And I will also leave a period for questions at the end. And the final thing is that I have a tendency to talk very quickly. If I'm talking too fast, feel free to just drop a message in the chat asking me to slow down or to repeat a particular point, but I will try to be mindful of that as well. So in terms of what I will be covering in more detail, so firstly, I'll do some brief stuff about in the long term, how to maximize your ability to think of content, because I think that it's not just something that you can like magically fix overnight. So like things to do by yourself. Then I'll spend the greatest quantity of time of like in prep, just giving a series of things that you can do to think of better content and to think of more content. And then finally, I'll just talk a little bit about how this differs on back half and BP and how to think of unique and creative extensions in prep. So starting out with long-term things for matter generation improvement, because while you can drill to try and get better at this, I think that there are a few things that you need to do over maybe a period of a few months that will help a lot with this. So I think that the first major thing of how to think of better content is that the reality is that a lot of it is just debate osmosis. So what I mean by that is that the longer that you're in debate for, you begin to hear more arguments, and therefore it just becomes easier for you to think of more stuff. That being said, though, there are a variety of things that you can do at tournaments and while you're speaking to kind of speed up the process of how you're able to absorb matter. So some of this stuff may sound trivial, but I think it's really important to hear it and actually be mindful of it in rounds. So I think that one really big thing is to listen to other speeches in the rounds, especially at online tournaments. I think that people have a tendency on front half after they speak to like zone out of back half. But I think a useful thing to do is to flow very carefully other speeches that occur after you, which will help you hear more creative things that back half teams are saying. Even if they're not the best teams, they can often still have creative ideas you might not have thought of that you can then build on in future arguments. Another useful thing to do at tournaments is to watch out rounds of, especially of speakers on the circuit who are more competitive, and then to hear useful things that are being said there. Another thing to do to speed up the process or to watch debate-related videos. So especially for stronger tournaments like round robin based competitions where all the teams are competitive, and videos where the RFDs filmed as well can be very helpful for long-term matter generation. And note that if you're watching a video and you see the same motion, you should never be copying and pasting the argumentation of speakers because you will often do that poorly. The judge might have seen the round, but more importantly, just because the case was good in one room, especially on back half, it does not mean that it will work in your room as well, especially because a lot of the time on back half, extensions are like filling in deadlocks that exist in front half in a particular room, and they cannot be cross-applied well to all debates. Another thing is that if you're in a round and you are like stumped with an extension or you do not really know what case to run, always just reach out to your judge or to like older members of your debate society. So these are just trivial things that I think are very valuable for improvement of matter generation in the long term. Another more long-term thing is just the importance of being well-read. I don't think it's about memorizing facts of like a country's GDP, but the more context that you know about, the easier it is to think of different cases where an argument might apply, and knowing a case study might then help you extrapolate and think of new argumentation stemming from that case study. So just try your best to like follow the news or to read a variety of sources, and if you have a spec-based weakness, to try and read about that particular thing. So this is just more basic long-term stuff that I think is important to go over, but I'm now going to get into the meat of the talk of like in prep time, what are ways that you can think of good matter and think of a lot of matter. So there's about 7 or 8 different pointers here. So I think that the first one, which also might seem a bit trivial, but is important, is to reflect on your own style of thinking and what will enable you to think of the most content and to think of the most creative content. So there are some people who require longer periods of time of silent prep, whereas other people's brains work better to constantly bounce ideas off of your partner. I think it's good to try a few different prep styles and see the different ways of communicating with your partner that will allow you to think of the most creative content, and also have a conversation with your partner about what prep style works the best for them, such that you can find a hybrid that works the best for the both of you. So I think that the best way to kind of experiment with this is via trial and error of just seeing how your brain works best. I know, like for me, I need a longer period of time of silent prep than most speakers because it takes my brain a couple minutes to think of the best content. So if you need that, just make sure to chat to your partner and to utilize that. The second major pointer is to think of different actors who might be impacted by a particular emotion. So I think that a lot of the time when people are starting debate, they kind of like break down who emotion may affect into different stakeholders and actors. But then as you get better at debate, too many debaters skip over this phase, which causes a lot of argumentation to be left out. So in most motions, especially I would say in social justice motions, there's almost a different argument that can be made based on different actors that are going to be impacted. So for example, in a debate about choice feminism, and like whether feminism should kind of embrace the idea that women should do whatever they want, regardless of whether it's patriarchal, there's going to be impacts on like second wave feminists who might be angry from this, of younger feminists, of men. And for each different stakeholder who might be impacted, you could create a unique argument that stems from that. So even though like you can't make generic arguments about buy-in, given that different groups within feminism are going to think of this policy differently. I think that this is also very helpful in IR motions. So for example, about motions on sanctions, there's going to be impacts on like the government, impacts on innocent civilians in the country, impacts on neighboring countries. So it's very useful at the beginning of prep to like break down who the motion might impact into these different stakeholders, but also to like subdivide stakeholders into more depth, which especially in motions that appear to be more shallow, can actually help a lot of creative argumentation to come up and to make things more nuanced. So a lot of the time in arguments or in debate motions about religion, it will often be generalized like, oh, this religious group might buy in more, or there might be backlash. But if you kind of subdivide religious groups into like more moderate and into more conservative people, this can help not only make better subpoints, but also to actually think of new content based on the more niche stakeholder who's going to be impacted the most. So I think that at the beginning of prep, this is just a very useful thing to do. The next pointer that I have is to think of different contexts where emotion might apply. So I think that the classic example of this is a developing versus a developed world dichotomy. So there's often very, very different impacts of emotion that will occur in the developed world. So an example of this is in the motion, this house regrets the use of nostalgia within politics. There's a very different subset of impacts that would occur in the developed and in the developing world. So in Western liberal democracies, there's often just arguments about like, does this create better or worse policy? But in post-colonial states in particular, there's a subset of arguments about how the use of nostalgia might be used by post-colonial parties to either build their own cult of personality that can be bad for holding them accountable, or you could argue that it's actually a valuable way to construct national identity. So thinking of different contexts is a very valuable way to find new arguments that you might not have thought of initially. And thinking of new contexts is not only about like developing versus developing world, it's also just about like at the national level, you could subdivide this more. So an emotion about like housing prices or housing development, there would be very different impacts in regions that are poor, in regions that are gentrifying, in regions with rapidly rising house prices. And the more context that you think of, not only will you guarantee that your case covers the most case scenarios and therefore will seem the most plausible to the judge, it's also a way to think of entirely new impacts. And even if thinking of more context, once again, doesn't allow you to make new arguments, it will also just strengthen your own case because it will apply in a greater quantity of circumstances. The next tip that I have in prep in particular is to think about what the most likely comparative is going to be. So by comparative, I think that most of you probably know this term, but just like what is the world most likely to be under both sides of the house. So not only making arguments that are true in your world, but are also going to be true kind of on the other side of the house. And I think that when it comes to argument generation, thinking comparatively is particularly important in either this house regrets motions or in motions about like this house prefers a world where X is better, or like where X exists. And the reason being is that you have a lot of power to think about how the world would appear. That is not only important for framing, but it helps you generate new arguments. So in the motion of like this house regrets the dominance of the dollar, it's not only important on prop or on op to think like strategically about what the world would look like, but there's often a subset of arguments about what the most likely currency would be in its place. So on op, there might be arguments of like the dollar is imperfect, but the most likely currency that would dominate in the future might be like the Chinese currency, which is worse because it will exacerbate soft power in X, Y, and Z way. So thinking about what the other side of the house is likely to be will help generate arguments that will significantly strengthen your own case. I think that another useful example of this is in the motion, this house regrets the glorification of forgiveness. On op, there could be a series of arguments about how in a world where we don't glorify forgiveness, the most likely response is likely to be one of anger directed toward other people that will carry a host of harms. So in these kinds of motions, thinking very comparatively will allow you to choose what the most likely world is going to be in a way that is convenient for your own side, and then you can build new argumentation based on what the other world is most likely to look like. So that's about thinking very comparatively. The next thing that I think is really important is to think about arguments that the other team is likely to make, and then find ways that you can clash with these arguments preemptively. So I think that this pointer is particularly true in contexts where you're having a difficult time thinking of stuff, but also where you're scared that the arguments that you're thinking of might not be on clash. So especially in very broad motions that might be philosophical, you have some creative ideas, but you're worried that the judge is going to say something like your case kind of fell out of the round. So I think that a very useful thing to do is to think of claims that the other team is likely to say, especially if one side of the motion might be more intuitive than the side of emotion that you are advocating for. And in the majority of cases, this will not only help guide your own thought processes, but if you're really stumped, what you can do is actually think of refutation to a major argument that you know the other team is going to say. And often what you'll do is you won't only think of like a mitigatory refutation, which at worst you can kind of run such that you at least have something to say, but you will often think of one or two responses that can actually flip the major claim that the other team is making. Justice motion about being better for victims, some of your refutation might mitigate how bad things are for victims, but you might be able to think of a claim about why victims are actually better off under your side of the house and then flip that logic. And even if you're worried that your case might sound too preemptive, you can then recraft this refutation in a way where it just seems very clearly like positive material for your side of the house. And this will allow you to not only think of more stuff, but you will also think of stuff that you know will directly clash with what other teams, and particularly with what back half teams are likely to run, but would just make sure that you're on clash. And I would posit here that even if you feel fairly comfortable with your own case, it's still useful to take a couple minutes, especially if the other case is more obvious, to think about what they're likely to say to help to outweigh that case implicitly. But also just to make sure that your arguments are kind of going in the right direction of what the route is more broadly going to be. The next thing that I would advise is to spend a little bit more time to think if there is a principle at hand in motions where principle is not something that is evident. So in most motions, a principle will be very, very clear, but I think that not only in debate is there a trend where principles are demonized too much, I think that there is a lot of opportunities where a principle could be run, but the speakers don't think creatively enough in that direction. So I'll give a couple of notions where I think that there are hidden principles that are actually quite easy to weigh and that could be quite intuitive that are easy to think of. So in the motion, this house as a Western liberal democracy would prefer relationships with a stable autocracy to an unstable democracy. I think that in opposition, there's an interesting claim to make that in the majority of cases, regimes that tend to run stable autocracies are more immoral than unstable democracies, just given structurally, like, there are fewer checks and balances. They need to act in ways that are more oppressive to solidify their own power, and therefore you are funding a regime that is worse in nature, so it's moral. So while your tendency might be to run arguments that are very, very IR based, there are often sneakier principles that can be effective. I think that another example of this could be in the motion, this house prefers a world with teleportation. I was in a motion where front half said the very obvious, like, good and bad things of, like, it's easier to help post-conflict societies, or this could be exploited by, like, criminals and bad actors, etc. Whereas on CG, I think that there's an interesting principle to make about guaranteeing that people are autonomous in realizing choice. So our preferences are capped by the number of lived experiences that we've had. And we can only make choices that are best for ourselves when we maximize the number of life experiences. And teleportation uniquely allows you to acquire new experiences in the context of your life, because new people that you meet and new places that you live are very important in informing your own identity. So you can actually make a principle about helping people become more free and about choice in motions where this kind of stuff is not particularly obvious. Excuse my dog's barking. I'll wait like 30 seconds for them to stop. You know what? I'm just gonna move. Hopefully it'll be a bit quiet here. So I think that in motions, especially where you're against competitive teams and front half is very good, finding a principle can be a useful way to extend or a useful way to add on to your case. Also, if you're a front half team and your back half is very good, it's often useful, especially in a deputy speech, to burn a possible nuanced principled extension such that they aren't able to just extend and run on the basis of that. And it's also just like, if you're stemmed or you think your case is one-dimensional, can be a useful way to expand impacts. The thing that I would caution here is just like kind of a notion on principles in general, is that while the argument can be very good, it's important not to rush them and not to just run through with like circular reasoning, and to make sure that you explain them properly. But even more importantly than that, it's vital that you're framing the principles well. So you're explaining why they're important in the context of the round, how they interact with the framing of other teams, but also why a principle is like a more compelling moral reason to do something. And if you do all of these things, I think that they're actually an incredibly helpful and valuable kind of argumentation. One more example that I'll give of where this is very effective that just came to mind at a recent tournament that I was at is there was a motion about you are a struggling sports club, you're feeling economically, you aren't doing well. A Saudi investment fund has offered to buy up your club. As the fans, would you accept having this fund effectively buy up your club? A lot of opposition teams tried to run arguments about like harming your club identity, but there was a really interesting off argument here that was actually, there's not much I can do. That was actually principally based, which was effectively the claim that you're going to be funding, like, the Saudi fund is directly linked to the Saudi government, and if you accept this money, you become complicit in a lot of the abuses that the government is by implicitly propping them up, which I think is like actually a fairly true line of logic and is a useful way to help outframe other teams that are battling for practical ground here. The next thing is that I think is also stands a bit trivial, but is very important and can help, is to think about similar motions that you've debated with similar clash points. So there's often motions that are like playset in a different part of the world, but have similar underlying clashes, or just like the crux of what you need to prove is quite similar to other motions, but you're talking about a new demographic. So it might be like a very, very similar motion about like, for example, like, do we want civil rights leaders to run for political office? And then you'll get a motion like the next week or two that's like, should like environmental leaders run for political office? And the underlying clashes here will be very, very similar. Similarly to what I said about watching videos does not mean that you should copy and paste argumentation. Having similar motions does not mean that you should copy and paste argumentation. It's a useful way that you can draw an underlying analysis. And the main thing now that you have the just nuance, or like the kind of illustrations and the kind of examples that you're using, and adding new contextualization based on the new demographic that you're talking about. But definitely rack your brain for like another motion that you might have debated that was similar that can help jumpstart the kind of ideas and argumentation that you're thinking of. The final more like thing to do in prep just in general is to think about whether you have fiat power. So if you're confused about when exactly you have fiat power, I recommend reading the WUDC manual. I think that teams too often use fiat power just as a tool to like mitigate the other team's case of being like, oh, you have this one radical reform, we can also do some of this. But I think that in motions where like in like policy motions where prop is doing something that is very, very radical, you can often use fiat power to actually think of new argumentation. So in the motion, this house would mandate that everyone use public defenders. I think that on op, you have a lot of fiat power to just like talk about reforms that you would make to the justice system overall and like how you would ensure that public defenders are like better funded for people. And it's not only to mitigate, but you can create arguments about why your fiat is like a better way to actually solve and to actually target the problem than what prop is advocating for. Alternatively, in a motion I did recently that was like this house supports like a cash prize for pharma companies who are trying to innovate rather than the current patent system. You have a lot of fiat power on op. I think that a case you can run on op is like why like you don't need to say that the patent system works, but you can argue that a model of like subsidizing drugs is a better way of targeting the problem. And it's not only to like say in your model we support X, Y, and Z counter model, but your own constructive case can incorporate positive elements about why the case that you're fiating is the best way to solve the problem, which I think is a useful way to generate matter. So in terms of just general prep strategies, are there any specific questions about this before I get more in particular about front half and back half strategies stemming from this? Okay, great. If not, I will talk briefly about applications to front half and then spend more time talking about back half. So on specific front half related things, what I want to really caveat here is that thinking of the most arguments is really not the end all and be all of debate. In fact, sometimes if you reach a phase where you become better at thinking of matter, there are ways that this can actually hurt your case because you try and run too much things and then the things that you run are not well developed. So on front half, I think that there's an important balance that needs to be struck between turf burning and between developing claims that you've decided to run well. And I think that in making trade-offs between whether you should turf burn or not, it should depend on a couple things. So number one, on whether you think it is possible to win on one or two arguments. So often in a motion will just be one or two arguments that you know are like killer. And if you prove that thing well, other teams are not going to be able to outweigh you. You have massive arguments about social change that you think is just like true. It is more important than things that the other team will say. If you know that you have one or two winning arguments, you don't need to run every single claim that you think of. Just run the one or two things and make sure that you frame it really, really well so that you weigh it really heavily. You can flag explicitly why your own backup is going to have a difficult time beating that argument. And then in that case, turf boarding just becomes unnecessary when your path to victory incorporates things that you can just accomplish in a much faster span of time. That being said, I think that turf burning becomes a little bit more necessary when is very, very strong as a team, or when there's not a couple arguments that are like particularly strong and easy to frame. Arguments could potentially be developed in a way that are very persuasive. In these cases, it'd be better to, oh no, my internet's unstable. It's more important to run more things to insulate yourself against a better back half. But keep in mind, you still need to frame the things you run well and don't spread too much in PM or LO. You can also bump some of the new content to your deputy speech, especially if the other front half team is weaker. So just in front half, I don't really have too much to say here, but just depending on the kind of content that you think of, you need to make that strategic trade-off between to run and between how well you run particular things. That should be dependent on particular teams in the room, and should also be dependent on the content that you happen to think of. We really want to spend the bulk of time then in the next part of the seminar are specific ways in back half to think of the best kind of content in prep, especially against front half teams who are stronger. So one thing here that I think is very, very helpful are to think about deadlocks that are the most likely to emerge within front half clashes. So what I mean by deadlocks are when the judge hears issues and they're often like, to me, that ended in a wash, or issues that are often just competing characterizations that are difficult to resolve. These are often things that happen at the end of front half, and I think that too often back half teams don't exploit this. So I think that what we should be doing in prep are often to spend a couple minutes thinking of where front half is like the most likely to get stuck and whether the particular clashes in a round lend itself to an issue being stuck. So an example of deadlocks that often occur at the end of front half is in politics motions. There will often be one side that is like, we get this group of voters, and then one side will be like, we get Y group of voters. And there's a lot of room to extend by simply saying like, front half argue that these two groups of voters exist. The more relevant question is why this group of voters is more important than another group of voters, and you can structure your extension around the idea of like this group of voters being larger in size, or there's a larger tipping point when it comes to swaying them, or there are more sustainable voting demographics, stuff like that. So you can just find ways to think about ways to like break issues that front half gets stuck on. Another example of how you can potentially find a deadlock of in the motion that says this House believes that states should not invest in reconstructing areas that are highly prone to natural disasters. A deadlock that often occurs in front half is whether people are able to leave these areas or not, because government is going to say it's a waste of resources because disasters just occur all the time. And then opposition says, well, like, no, these people are screwed because they are stuck in these regions and therefore the state ought to help them. A useful thing that back half teams can like weigh in on is whether relocating these people to other areas is actually possible and whether they will be able to leave. And thinking about these kind of things in prep is really helpful because sometimes in the round, you can identify what the deadlock is as a clash begins to unfold, but especially when you're trying to also think of your own extension material and you can't really fully listen to deputy speakers, you will miss this in prep, or you will be able to think of the stuff in the round, but it will be a lot less well refined than if you took time in prep to actually think about what these areas of deadlock are the most likely to be. And an extension that's based on resolving a deadlock is not going to be derivative if you have judges that are good or that are decent. Something to be cautious of when you're running this is to make sure that you don't miss things that deputies say to break this deadlock. So personally, I've had cases where like at the end of PM and LO, the clash very much is a deadlock. But if you're writing your extension during deputy speeches, just make sure that you're either listening while writing or you're having your partner double check that a deputy speaker is not resolving and is not breaking the deadlock to guarantee that you're not going to be a derivative stemming from that. So that's on thinking about deadlocks in back half prep. The second main thing I would say for back half prep in particular is to think of ways to enlarge the scope of an impact that front half is talking about. So often in motions, there'll be like 2 or 3 obvious things that front half is going to say that are really important. And then you kind of just are like, crap, like, how can I think of something that is more impactful than that? I think a useful thing to do here in back half prep is to think about an argument that a front half team is likely to say, but then think of a new way of impacting that claim that is likely to be very, very distinct, such that even if front half gets credited for mechanizing the claim, you will get credited for enlarging the impact to such an extent that it fundamentally changes the way up of the motion. I think an example of this is in motions about economics. So let's say there's one team that's like, let's say it's a motion about like labor versus like environmental protections, and then you're on the side of the house that's like prioritizing economics, and your front half is like an economic crisis or a crash can be really, really bad if we don't prioritize economics. A useful way that a team could enlarge the scope of this impact is by talking about like international financial contagion. So it's not only a domestic issue, but due to the high level of interconnectedness of the international banking system, if you allow like this economically important country to go under because banking systems are so connected, this will then have a rippling effect when it comes to other countries' economic well-being. So even if front half lays the groundwork for this claim, thinking of a larger impact is really important, provided that you frame the impact that you think of properly in the context of the round. And I think you should absolutely be thinking of how you can frame this impact in prep, because you don't want to run into the problem of the judge being like, we agree that you have this new impact, but we credit front half with all of the mechanization. I think the most useful way to frame kind of like thinking of your impact is by saying, it was very difficult previously in the round to weigh the importance of various arguments. Opening up said that like economics is really important for X, Y, and Z reason, and then but Gov also gave compelling reasons about why we should care about the environment. So you can't really credit our openings mechanization if they never explained why the trade-off or their impact was more important than other teams. But by unlocking a new set of impacts, our team fundamentally shifts the entire weighing calculus of the debate because we identified this argument that was substantially more important. And thinking of like spin-offs of impacts of your front half, it's a really useful way to make your extension seem really impactful. The next thing that I would say about in back half prep in particular is to have a specific emphasis on impacts that are likely to be longer term than what your front half is going to talk about. So front half is often very much just like, in the short term, here are the implications of this policy. And I think that the most useful framing device that you can have on back half is often to explain why the impacts of what you're talking about is likely to be a lot more tangible. So in a motion that is seemingly shallow about like, this house would give X disprivileged group of people the right to vote, i.e. like migrant workers the right to vote, you might have a front half on Gov talking about like the benefits of short-term policy change. But if you could think about making a longer term impact persuasively, for example, about like giving a group the right to vote might have like a humanizing effect on how other people perceive them, that will then help trickle down into like other kinds of rights being granted. This longer term thinking is just a very, very useful way to outweigh argumentation that your front half is making. Additionally, in an argument, in like a policy debate, let's say front half is talking a lot about like the likelihood of getting a policy passed. If you can think of a subset of argumentation about why a subsequent government is less likely to overturn a policy because you get more buy-in. So an example of a motion like this could be like holding referendums on peace agreements. If you can say, if you and backup are thinking more long term, you might think of an argument of like, it's not really about which side gets a better peace deal if the next government is just likely to overturn the initial peace deal that was formed. Therefore, it's more important that you get public buy-in to prevent the deal from being appealed by subsequent administrations. It's a very useful way to outframe what your front half is talking about. So always just think about maybe longer term impacts that are likely to occur from a policy. What I would caution here is make sure that you're still thinking about plausibility. So you have like illustrations or examples that will make your long-term impact seem more plausible, and don't go for these like massively big impacts if you think that you'll have too much difficulty explaining and proving that they're actually correct. But definitely just keep this long-term thinking in mind. The next thing I would posit on back half is to think about lengths of argumentation that front half is the least likely to develop well. So you know the arguments that your front half is likely to make, but they're often a series of relatively classic mistakes that teams make when developing arguments that are very, very useful to weigh in on. The most, I think, the way that I think this happens the most often is you will hear a team being accused of like not proving a delta in a particular argument, meaning that they don't prove why an argument is actually going to be like the tipping point for a valuable kind of political change. And I think that often what you can do on back half is to think about what these links that front half is going to miss are the most likely to be, and then ways then to build in those links, i.e. what X policy will actually result in like a mass mobilization of people and create valuable kinds of change. This is really important because when you do this, I think it's a way that you will have analysis extensions that are the most effective, i.e., it's often a waste of time in prep, especially if you're stumped to just like really thoroughly flush out arguments that you think that your front half will develop well. It's a better use of back half content generation prep time to think of what the strategic weaknesses of a particular front half argument are the most likely to be, and then to build things in prep to address that. There's a question that I'm just going to read briefly. Okay, so the question is, in this scenario that you have bad framing from opening and bad framing from CG, is it good to reframe the debate in CO and explain why that is the best possible frame, or just engage in debate in the worst case scenario for you within the frame that is kind of being created by other teams? I think that it is probably good to do a combination of both, and I also think that it depends on like how bad the framing is from the other teams and how likely it is that the judge is going to buy your new reframing. I think that the difficulty of adding an entirely new frame at closing opposition while spending less time engaging in the framing of other teams is that if the judge does not buy a frame, you're basically screwed and you're going to take the floor, no matter how true you think that it is. So even if you try and run new framing, definitely at least have some like rebuttal that explains why your framing exists in the world of other teams. So I think that this is very much just a strategic decision of like how bad is the framing from the other teams, how likely is the judge to buy your new framing. If you think, especially, and it should just depend on like where you are at the tournament. If you're in like a final or something, definitely try and reframe the debate from CO. But if you're in like an outrun, for example, where like you only have to take a 2, or like a bubble where you need like a 2 or 3, you might not want to go for a very high risk approach, and in that case probably spend more time just engaging with like the dominant framing that is being created by the room and like why you win even in the worst case and stuff like that. In most extensions, if you have time, you can actually just do a combination of both things. Okay, so in terms of the thing about the material that your front half is least likely to develop well, just a better prioritization of time and running analysis extensions. The final kind of thing I'll say on back half prep before opening it up for questions is to think about fundamental weighings that the round is likely to boil down to. So in a round, for example, about like minimum wage, let's say front half makes like really good arguments of like, this is good for workers because they need more money, and then the other half is like, all the people will get unemployed. You can just say things like look, like the trade-off of the motion is very obvious and very obviously implied in both the motion and in both the info side. What the round really comes down to is how we should weigh up these issues relatively. This is similar to deadlocks, but it's a bit different. Especially in motions, there's like fundamental tensions between like justice and equality. Just thinking of a large quantity of weighing mechanisms about why one thing is more important than the other, and then framing front half of not engaging in the heart of the debate is just a useful way to think of potential like weighing-based extensions. So this is kind of all I have to say about broad tips for content generation. I know it was a little bit short, but I really do think that these are like the main things. If you have any specific questions about things that I mentioned, or just other questions that are kind of related to things that I mentioned, feel free to ask them now. I will hang around in the call for a few minutes. I'll just remain muted for like 5 minutes in case questions start popping up. Okay, so the question is, if you have a bad judge, is it good to make more complex arguments if you have very good teams, or is it better to just go for kind of a rhetoric-based approach? This is a good question. I think that like if you know the judge, it depends on like what kind of bad they are. So are they bad because they weigh arguments in weird ways, or are they bad because you cannot understand the kind of arguments that you're making? If you've had this judge before, just think about like what about how the adjudicate is poor, and then make a decision stemming from that. So if you know that they are just the kind of judge like can't really understand complex things, then yes, go for the simple and go for the more rhetoric-based approach to argumentation. That being said, I think it is often best to run more complex ideas still, and like don't dumb down your debating too much, but simplify how you explain those ideas. So not necessarily change your arguments, but add more illustrations than you would otherwise. So more examples, maybe fewer mechanisms and fewer impacts, but better explains the one that you run. More like of the kind of debating of like, here's how this policy looks like on the ground, stuff like that. And like, even if you don't have any examples, like here's how this actor is likely to respond when this policy is impacted. So like combination between still running the arguments and then kind of dumbing it down to a larger extent. Isabella, can you specify what you mean by how would you explicitly? Okay. Okay, go for the next question. Okay, so there's another question about what do you do when you don't know anything about a particular motion, when you're like completely out of ideas. So yeah, so a lot of the things that I mentioned earlier in the seminar, I think would like cross apply to this of like, think about a similar motion that you've debated, think about whether there's a principle at stake, stuff like that. That being said, I think there are probably also like more things you can do if you know like absolutely nothing about the motion. I think the most useful thing is just like resort to like first principles in this case. So what I mean by that are just like more generic arguments that can always be applied. So in a motion about like intervening a particular country, if you know like nothing about that country or what is going on, just like resort to like very basic first principles of like, here is why sovereignty could exist, or here are some potential harms I can think of for intervention, and then just make more like general claims that kind of flow from that. Is kind of the basic thing that I can advise. And also like, I would just, this sounds very obvious, but like don't panic. In 15 minutes, there's probably something that you could think of and it'll probably be on the right track. Just do all the stuff I mentioned about like actor breakdowns, thinking of similar emotions, and that should help. Okay, the next question is, sorry, give me a sec to process. Okay, Orlando, let me know if I'm not understanding your question, but what I think that you're asking is like, what do you do when front half is like either fully mechanized and not impacted, or fully impacted and not mechanized? I'm not sure if this is the question like what you do on back half, but I think that like the thing is just like very clearly flag for the judge what was missing in front half, and then just like fill it in. And explain why it's not derivative, because just frame very clearly, like in order for the front half argument to be true, they either have to A, explain whether impact was likely, or in the case where they don't impact it, explain the strategic relevance of their max for the round as a whole. And then I think you can just like run an analysis extension where you just fill in the missing thing that front half didn't have. Especially if your judges are weaker, just be very explicit about why front half had to do that particular thing within their argument for their argument to actually hold weight in the round strategically. And I think that you should be fine. Okay, how do you identify principles in motions where they are not as obvious? I don't really think that there's like a magic thing that you can do where you just like suddenly think of them. I think it's more like allocating time and prep, particularly in motions that vaguely deal with international relations or vaguely deal with autonomy and choice, to like think, is there a potential principle at stake here? So just like allocating that time for yourself mentally, I think is a good way to uncover them. I think that another thing that you can potentially do is like, if you have a motion where there's a practical impact, think about if there's a principal dimension to that practical impact. So maybe in a teleportation motion, you would have thought of the idea, like if you have more life experiences, it is good for your identity because you can make more choices. Think about if relating to that practical impact, there's also a set of principles as well that are similar to that. So like if you can take a practical impact about making better choices to a principle thing about why you have the right to be able to make those kind of choices. Let me think if there's anything else. I think this is also just like a debate osmosis thing of like, you get used to hearing ways that teams manage to extend and manage to find principles. I think that a useful thing that you can do or just like after rounds, just like think maybe there a principle I missed. Just like recall principles that other teams ran in similar motions, and then just think about potential ways that this could be applied in like a broader number of cases or broader number of motions. But other than just like thinking more consciously for principles, I unfortunately don't think that there's a magic way to generate it. What are the questions to think about when you're trying to compare an impact extension with front half mechanization. Okay, so I think that questions to think about are like why front half's mechanization and the way that they tried to impact it was either sufficient or insufficient. So that is the way, are the mechs that front half gave and any ways that they tried to impact it sufficient and actually outweighing other teams? If you think that the answer is yes, you probably can't win just on the basis of an impact. But if you think that they don't fully explain the scope of what their impact means, then that's a useful way that you can kind of just like swoop in and then find that new impact and then run that extension. So I don't really think there's major questions to ask other than was the impacting that front half did sufficient. One more thing I'll just say on this topic that's not directly answering the question, but I think is like that I think is related. If you have a really large impact, but you're scared that the judge is going to be like, oh, the front half gave all of the max to get to that impact, one thing that I think that can be helpful is to just add one or two mechs. And you can acknowledge, like, even if they're not necessarily better than the front half mechs, there's still a new way that you got to the impact that you unlocked on back half. And it can just be a useful way to promote like a safety valve, especially if like the judge might think that front half's mechs were not great. It can just be a useful way that's less derivative to show you got to that particular kind of impact. Yeah. Are there any other questions or clarifications based on answers that I gave to questions? If upper half mechanized the very obvious argument really well, is it strategic to extend or explain the impact? Once again, I think it depends on the kind of motion and how much impacting front half did. If it's one of those debates where both teams sort of agree on the impact, i.e., like how can we get better policy, and your front half set all the max for that impact, then in that case, it's not that strategically helpful to run an impact-based extension. The times where these kinds of extensions are the most valuable is if teams differ on what the important issue in the round is, and there's a difficulty to weigh up impacts that different teams are claiming. In this case, if the obvious argument is mechanized well, but front half does not explain strategically what their mechanization does in the round, or weigh the mechanization against the tangible impacts that other teams have given, in that case, I think running an impact-based extension can be really helpful. Yes, if no one has any questions, I think that we're good to finish up.
Yeah, okay. If there isn't any question, I think we are gonna close this workshop. Thank you, Naomi, for the workshop. It was great. And everyone will attend this workshop. See you at the PDC this weekend. Thank you all.